Welcome to the MeherBaba program. I'm your host, Fred Stankus, and today's program is A Dance of Love, the life story of Margaret Craske. In the opening, you noticed photographs of Baba and film footage of MeherBaba, and three incredible women who were depicted in there was Countess Nadine Tolstoy, Princess Norina Machiavelli, and Margaret Craske, who our program is about. Princess Machiavelli, Norina Machiavelli, the famous Machiavelli family perfume line, which is quite world famous, was a follower of MeherBaba. Also, Countess Nadine Tolstoy, a daughter of the relatives of the great Tolstoy of Russia, was a follower. And then Margaret Craske came to know about MeherBaba. With me in studio is Caroline MacDonald, who was with Margaret Craske for several years in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and got to know her. Margaret Craske is recognized as a master teacher of ballet. And Caroline is with me today to tell us a little bit about Margaret Craske and her life with beloved MeherBaba. Hi, Caroline.
Hi.
And tell us a little bit about Margaret Craske's background in ballet.
All right, I have a couple of things written down here about Margaret. She was born in Norfolk, England in 1892, and she taught ballet for Enrico Cecchetti, who was the founder of the Cecchetti method of ballet, which is pretty much ballet as we know it these days. She taught for him for 5 years in London, beginning in 1910, and she wrote a book at his request about his method. Margaret said Cecchetti's method was based on the days of the week. She used to talk to me a lot about Cecchetti. She was an admirer of his. And she said that his method worked particular muscle groups on different days. She was one of the first English dancers to appear with a Russian ballet group, Diaghilev Ballet, before the outbreak of World War II. Over the years, she has instructed some of the world's best dancers at the Sadler's Wells Ballet Company, which was later the Royal Ballet, the American Ballet Theater, the American Opera Ballet School, and the Manhattan School of Dance. And this was her public life. She was involved in dance and taught dance until not too long before she retired, which I guess she was in her early 90s. She taught dance until the end.
And how did you first start working with Margaret Craske?
Well, I lived in Myrtle Beach and had lived there for a couple of years, knew of Margaret, had really never even met her. I met her briefly one time. My next door neighbor, Barbara Gone, was taking care of Margaret, and she had 24-hour care at that time because she was she could use a walker and a wheelchair, but she was pretty much bedridden. So I was just so intrigued with Margaret and was interested in working with her, and finally Barbara managed to find one night of the week that I could stay with her. So I was on the night shift. I would come in at usually about 11 o'clock and stay all night until about 8 o'clock the next morning.
So did she tell you some stories about MeherBaba and her life with him?
She told me many stories about Baba. In fact, she would generally wake up about 3 to 6 times a night, and because she slept very little during those days, and she would have a little bell that she would ring because I would be in another part of the house asleep, and she would call me and I would go in and help her with any personal need she had, or get her a snack, and sometimes she just wanted to talk, and she would tell me stories, or she would ask me to read things to her.
What was the key point of the tremendous attraction that Margaret Craske seemed to command in her lifetime, not only in her teaching as a tremendous ballet, well, she was a ballet dancer,
right,
and she danced in London, and then of course she became one of the foremost teachers of ballet in the world. Did you ever get a chance to get a feeling of people who danced for her or knew her? What essence did she sort of convey to them? What was her of the feeling that was so predominant?
Her dancers were like her children, and they would often come to visit her, especially near the end when she was more infirmed and sick, and they would come and spend time with her, and they just adored her. And in fact, this book here, there's an interesting quote about, I was looking through this and I found something about her teaching. She was strict, but she was not overbearing. And this right here says, Craske is strict, but she is not an autocrat. And this is from the book Behind Bars, B-A-R-R-A-S. The glint of a girl's earring that would upset anyone else does not unduly bother her. Banter between students perspiring at the bar is generally overlooked, if it is brief and inaudible. Craske is confident of every eye, every ear attuned to her vibrations, every pair of legs set to spring. So she was known as being a strict teacher, but she wasn't cruel or overbearing to her students. She was kind, and she got across what she needed them to do in a loving way, and they loved her.
Do you know anything about her life in ballet and dancing as regard to her early life, or do you know more about her?
I know more about being with Margaret. I've read her books, and I know I've talked to the dancers that visited her, and I know that she is considered a master teacher that for many years.
And she came from New York City, isn't that correct?
Yeah, she lived there for many years.
Before she then came back to live in Myrtle Beach,
right,
in retirement per se, and so you were with her in her retirement days. And can you recall what she said about meeting MeherBaba? I know we are going to see a little bit of footage of Margaret talking about that, but do you remember anything about her first meeting? I know it happened under somewhat adverse conditions in her life as far as her family loss.
Right. She lost everything during World War II, during what's called the Blitz in London. She lost all her photos and memorabilia, and she met Baba, I think the first time was at Kitty Davies' house in London. And Kitty was also a longtime follower of Baba. She ran the Myrtle Beach Spiritual Center for many years until her death recently. But there's a quote in this book, and this is Margaret's book, that she wrote called The Dance of Love. And there's a wonderful little paragraph here about meeting Baba. She said, he was seated quietly in a chair. He signed to Chanji, who was one of his helpers, to bring another chair and place it facing in close to his. He then beckoned me to sit there. For a moment or so there was an intense quiet, and then I had a strong feeling that it was important to look into his eyes. Courage came, and I did so, looking in deeply, deeply as far as I could. I have nothing to say about what I saw. In fact, I don't know. I only know that from that moment, whatever rough treatment he may have afterwards handed out, there has never been a moment's doubt as to his being the embodiment of love and life.
Oh, that's a beautiful note for us to go to the video of Margaret Craske in an interview in 1988 in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina.
Where my expression was very different. My life was in the mood. I was really cool. Everybody at that time died off with her life. So I had to do direction and music, graduate, director of the died. A great dancer, and my husband, my father, my mother, and they all died, and I thought, well, of course, there's a little distribution in the world. And I said, oh, I see, definitely said, I have nothing to do with spiritual things. They can't exist. Then I went to judge a competition down in the third place, and I remember winning. She was not quite right in the head, I must say. She wore veils, that couldn't get her to me, she came up to me and she said, "No, Margaret, where are you going?" I'm doing the practical to judge a competition. And she said, "Oh, yeah, that's what I remember, and I've been looking at before to go back since." I said, "Listen, guys, you come with me. They come in here to run justice competition, and I pay for her, and you put her on the shield, and how many of that together." And I went down, I said, "Guys, you know somewhere I could go for a holiday. I want to go with all my friends." I felt like that. I was really very unhappy. And she said, "Yes, sir, and that's mine. It's just open to the face down the children from the star." And I said, "Oh, I can do this. And I did know the star. And I was going down with the holiday. It wasn't everybody. It wasn't easy. And I was trying to run from the station to Darling down there, this woman, we all had veils and all had beads and everything right along the station. And everybody cleared out of the train, they couldn't believe the apparition. And she reached the carriage where I was in, just as the train started right before her. He said, "I said to you, nothing ever takes you so long to go." I didn't have anything to do with it, because I thought, well, I'm a sister, they can't make me use for that, and that's it. Well, I went down, and I went on my car, and she walked with me over the hills to the little farmhouse before her death. And I stood there at the farmhouse open, the door was in the living room, nothing but the hall, there was no doorway. And on the window was Father's photo. And I said, "Who's that?" And I didn't give any notice of music. I didn't shake hands with Grand Hoods. I didn't do anything. I just said, "Who's that?" And I was stuck. I must say, from that moment, I knew something had happened. I didn't learn this word. When I was there, he should be very good star reputation. And said, "Well, told me that I should become like Margaret in meditation." So I told you, he was understood. So when we got to the last week, I said that the rest would be pretty much seated in the garden. And the chair, another chair, and the cat there, and I couldn't have the cat there for me, so we slept in the shirt and the mountain.
So then later, when you met Baba in London, what was it like to see him the first time?
What can I say? Nothing like. And I know what I said about it. If you were 4 years, I woke up in the middle of the night. I went to Margaret and this is the one. She said, "Someone they're making up the universe, so we can be on here." That's not what I was doing.
Now, I asked you at the beginning for a happy memory of Bob.
And we enjoyed some of the beautiful footage of seeing Margaret Craske, along with the lady in the green coat was Kitty Davy, and the other lady, Delia de Leon. This footage is called the Frivolous 3, and it was videotaped at the Myrtle Beach Spiritual Center in 1988. And as you can see, those three ladies have a tremendous sense of humor and a tremendous, you could say, jousting type of effect with each other. They thoroughly enjoy needling each other, and they were that way with Baba when Baba was alive. Caroline, looking at Margaret reminds me, I guess, of the time when you talked about nursing her, and being with her before she passed away. What have you, how has Margaret touched your or enriched your life in the years you've known her? I guess you knew her the last
About a year.
Of her life.
It's interesting because the more time goes by, the more I realize the effect. And I think a lot of the effect has been on my career, which is as a writer. I was thinking about it not too long ago, several months ago, when I gave a talk about her. One of the first articles I ever wrote, which was for a newspaper that I started with shortly before I started working with Margaret, called the Sun News in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. It's a Knight Ridder newspaper, very fine newspaper. One of the very first stories I wrote was about Margaret. And it was when some of the dancers had come to pay a tribute to her, and they did a beautiful dance number, and she was the guest of honor. And so I did a story about that, and then I realized that the very last story that I wrote for that paper before I moved to Los Angeles was Margaret's obituary. And so she pretty much spanned my time, the very beginning of my writing career. And when I would come to see her it was not an easy thing what I was doing, because I worked full-time during the day writing with the newspaper, which is very involving and emotionally involving in a lot of ways. Then, to make ends meet, I worked in the evenings as a banquet caterer. So, and often when I would go to Margaret's, it would be after a full day at the newspaper, a full evening at the nearby hotel that I worked at, and then on to Margaret's, and I would get there about 11 o'clock. So I was exhausted. And I think that was part of it, that being waken up so many times during the night when I was so exhausted was, I guess, good for me. It required me to constantly be trying to be on my best behavior because I was so tired. But often when I would come in, I would bring her stories that I had written during the week, and I would tell her about them, read parts to her, and she was very interested. She was working on her second book at the time with Ann Conlon with Sherryar Press in Myrtle Beach. So she would ask me to read things back to her because her eyes weren't that good at the time and she couldn't really read. So I would read passages that she had just been working on with Anne. And so it was a nice give and take there. It was a nice sharing.
And she was in her, late 90s?
She was in her 90s.
And she still had this tremendous brilliance. And the essence of that brilliance came through her. And I think you mentioned to me once that you felt a certain, I don't know, you could say, I don't know if it was a peacefulness being with her, how that affected you also. Like, I don't know if you could say it's a spiritual-like feeling. Was that experience too?
Yes, she was so devoted to Baba, and that came through so strongly to me. It was wonderful for me to be able to share in that and to see that devotion. And she had, pictures of Baba on the wall, and she always had a little picture that she kept right by the bed. And it was really wonderful.
Some of the stories with Baba, can you relate some of those stories of Margaret Craske with Baba, or some of the stories she related?
Yeah, she had some great stories. She often talked of Baba and Mehera, who was Baba's principal woman disciple, and she just adored Mehera. And she would describe Mehera. Mehera was very beautiful and very in a very pure way, but extremely beautiful. And Margaret would tell me how Mehera put all the Hollywood movie stars to shame because she was so beautiful. She was just like a light. And she would describe, Margaret's, for one thing, her hands, her gestures were incredibly beautiful because she was an artist and a dancer, and she would just, fling her hands and describe things. But she would describe Mehera's hair, because Mehera had, at the time, waist-length, beautiful hair. And so she would say her hair was just like this, and her hands would wave just like Mehera's hair. And she told me about one time Baba had asked her to teach Mehera to swim. And so Mehera, being so devoted to Baba, would, when he wanted her to do something, she would put herself into it wholeheartedly. So Margaret talked about how that day, I guess they were at a pool. There was a large pool where they were staying, so Mehera came for her first swimming lesson. And she was wearing a large Macintosh raincoat and galoshes. So this is because she was so shy, and she didn't even own a swimsuit, so she came in this outfit for her swimming lesson. So Margaret said she got in the water, and she said she sank like a stone. And it was she had all that stuff on. So they derived another outfit for her to swim in, and then Margaret was very impressed at how quickly she learned to swim, and she said she swam beautifully. And she said that, I remember her telling me that Mehera could learn so quickly and do things so beautifully because she was so devoted to Baba and doing it for him that she would concentrate wholeheartedly and pick things up, just like that.
Oh, that's a good story. And
Yeah.
also, wasn't there a story, can you relate that one, about the dog bites?
Oh,
that
gosh.
Margaret in her first years with Baba?
I remember
In
a
India?
little bit about that. She was bit by a rabid dog, and it swelled up, and I guess she was wanting a lot of attention from Baba, and he would say, "Oh, you'll be fine." He'd pat her on the arm, and he'd leave, and then they took a trip, and Margaret went with them on the trip. And I think Baba said she needed to go so he could keep an eye on her. So she was thrilled that she got to go on this trip, even though she was feeling a little bit left out of things and wasn't getting quite the amount of attention that she wanted. And it's much cuter the way Margaret tells it. There's another story that I found in my notes the other night that's funny. She used to tell me the funniest stories, and I'd just be cracking up. But Baba had placed her in charge of the animals. And there were monkeys and birds and cats and dogs and lots of animals around, so she was in charge. And she told me that in the mornings often the disciples, the Mandali, would recite the names of God over and over for, I think, half an hour. Early in the morning they would do this. And one morning Margaret said she was having a particularly difficult time with a couple of the animals that were misbehaving. So she went inside, and she was reciting the names of God over and over, and she was going on for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then she said she stopped because she realized that what she was saying over and over again was Sonny and Bunny, who were the names of two of the rabbits that were being mischievous. And so she was totally disgusted with herself, and at that moment Baba walked in. And he looked at her, and her face just fell. And he signed, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Baba, I'm no good at this. I can't do this. I'm saying the names of Sonny and Bunny over and over, and I'm not saying the names of God." And she said, Baba gave her a stern look, and then he just burst out laughing. So they both had a good laugh over that.
Well, that reminds me, I should say, it brings to mind some of the dancers that were tutored by Margaret, and I've met them in India and also at some of the meetings that Baba lovers have had here in Los Angeles. And I could mention some of the dancers that she trained that she basically told about Baba, and they came to Baba through her. I remember there was Peter Saul, there was Brenner Mell, Tex Hightower, I think Bunty Kelly, wasn't Bunty a dancer? And I think there's several others that I missed, but all these people were are very special people. Top ballet ballerinas, and they have danced in the New York City Ballet, Royal Ballet of London, and I had a good pleasure of meeting those people, and they just spoke so highly of Margaret. I could see it's time for us to wind up this program now. We're getting to that point, and Caroline, I really appreciate you coming today and describing a little bit about Margaret Craske and her relationship with Meher Baba. And so we hope to see you again on another Meher Baba program. Until our next program, thank you for joining us here on the Meher Baba program. And remember, don't worry, be happy. Jai Baba.